All right, so we're on. Um, just to say hi to Tori, Caitlin, and Kiara. I hope you're all feeling better. But it's your immune system. All right. So, we've been talking about antibodies and how a vaccine is going to stimulate those B cells to begin producing antibodies. But then we also had the whole mechanisms behind different kinds of cells in the immune system that are involved in different kinds of attacks. And so these are the T cells. And the cytotoxic T cells, where we finished off, they're able to recognize actually things like cancer cells, specifically cells that have gone off the reservation. They're dividing rapidly. They end up having a distinct signature that says this is probably not a cell that is doing its job properly. And the killer T cells, or cytotoxic T cells, can actually inject a protein that'll punch holes in the membrane and also inject a set of proteins and molecules that'll trigger that cell to go into directed cell death. And it works quite well, and it turns out that on an average month, you probably have a cell that picks up sufficient mutations that it can start to become a tumor. So around once a month or so. But our immune system is sufficiently tuned in to these kinds of mutations that they get pulled out, which is why people that have immune deficiency end up having and struggling with different kinds of cancers that are really very rare because our immune system is really good at taking them out. So lastly, there is a whole set of molecules that are collectively known as cytokines. These are small, diffusible molecules, and they are used in cell-cell communication. When we talk about chronic pain and inflammation, you're talking about the role of cytokines. And as it says, don't memorize the list. Let's think a little bit about some of the generalized functions. So, just from a perspective in the healthcare biz, when you're talking chronic pain is being generated by cytokines. And back, in the early part of the pandemic, there was a term kicked around, you may have seen in the news, something called a cytokine storm. And it is a general term for broad-scale inflammation. And these are the kinds of things that can begin to generate a fever. These are the things that generate redness and swelling. This is the stuff that is being secreted by cells in the immediate area of a wound. I mean, have you ever wondered if you get a splinter, A, it hurts, okay, that's neurons, but B, it starts to get red. It starts to get, you begin to have sensitivity all over. I actually had a splinter in my finger, but it's getting better now. This is because that wounding triggers a whole set of cell events. And one of the things that's happening here is when you get a jab, that jab is saying, hey, the outer barrier has been breached. The possibility of having bacteria now inside the body is now a real threat. Let's begin dumping all these different kinds of cell signaling molecules to recruit the immune system to this spot. So, not to be overly exemplifying, but when you're getting your vaccine shot, the initial pain is, of course, from the needle. That is, you try jabbing yourself anywhere in your body with a needle like that, right, that big, but that, and see how it feels. You're going to jab it in, and it's sterile. The area is sterile, but you definitely have a cytokine release at that spot. So that's going to happen when we have any kind of epithelial breach. All right, so interleukins are produced, and these are promoting helper T cells. Interleukins at various times have been used as potential anti-cancer therapeutics. Another one that perhaps you may have heard of is interferon. These are also somewhat anti-cancer possibilities. They are not particularly effective at treating cancer, but there's something that people have been studying for a while. Anyway, we have interleukins, and there's a number of them. IL-1, there's IL-2, IL-4, IL-5. These are all recruiting and activating different kinds of T cells. Another kind of cytokine is something called tumor necrosis factor. And this is a hormone that is attracting various monocytes and neutrophils. It also stimulates IL-1 secretion. Interferons are particularly associated with virally infected cells. So cells that are infected with viruses, they begin to secrete interferon. I think we actually had a little figure about this. And interferon can inhibit other neighboring cells from picking up the virus. Lymphotoxin, this is one of these things that is causing programmed cell death. It begins to degrade the DNA. Let's see, different kinds of inhibition factors perform. We actually looked at granzymes from the cytotoxic T cells. They are punching in holes and inducing apoptosis. TGF-beta, transferring growth factor beta, is found in T cells and monocytes. And it actually is able to slow up the immune response. And so that's one of the things that we have to think about when we have this immune response, is it can get carried away. So that actually brings us to this next point of autoimmunity. And it's a critical issue in that it's very important that cells and the immune system not attack self. Because the immune system is a very potent kind of cellular mechanism for destroying a bunch of stuff. And if you generate an autoimmune response, that's not going to be good. Autoimmune responses are responsible for everything from rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, and as more and more studies have been looking, that list of autoimmune diseases is increasing. Lupus is another classic autoimmune disease. Fairly broad categories of terms, but it is the immune system actually attacking self. So during very early development, actually in utero, we end up having a test, a selection of T cells interacting with the thymus, which you may have covered in A&P. The thymus, not to be confused with the thyroid. The thymus is a portion of tissue that actually, as you start to get a little bit older, 1, 2, 3 years old, maybe even before then, the thymus begins to shrink. And so it's not something that's being used once you are an adult. One of the roles of the thymus is, in fact, to handle the selection of self versus non-self or useful antibodies and things. And so we have developing T cells. They have to interact with the MHC and self antigens. If they fail to recognize the self MHC, then they're going to be eliminated. If they recognize the MHC, then they're going to be positively selected. And these are the survivors of this test. But within that group, if they bind MHC but also react with self, then they are triggered into cell-directed suicide. Because remember, the immune system is essentially blind. It is building B cells that can generate an antibody, and it does it just randomly. And so you have a collection of B cells that are producing antibodies that potentially can recognize self. And so those have to be eliminated. And they're eliminated in utero and during fetal development. And this is because, at this point, you're kind of immunologically naive. So, various kinds of problems. We have immune deficiencies. There can be genetic immune deficiencies. And you maybe have heard of some of these things. So, there is a condition in which you have no lymphocytes. This ends up being people, they refer to as bubble boys or children, in which they have to be placed inside a sterile environment. You can also acquire an immune deficiency, and the term is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. This happens through HIV infection. There are a range of environmental effects that cause immune deficiencies, and cancer treatment can very often do this. One of the reasons is cancer treatment is targeting rapidly dividing cells. When a B cell binds antigen, it's also rapidly dividing. And so consequently, those cells that are involved in an immune response are the ones that are being targeted for chemotherapeutics. So that's why people that are on chemotherapy end up being much more sensitive to infections and different kinds of immunological issues, because their ability to mount that immune response is inhibited. Other things that can do the same thing are things like radiation, which is, in very controlled ways, another cancer treatment. Radiation therapy or exposure to radiation is breaking up the DNA in chromosomes, and it's causing those cells to undergo apoptosis. And rapidly dividing cells, again, are going to be the most seriously threatened, and that's going to be some cells in the immune system. So, autoimmune disease, just as we were talking a little bit about, the body is itself an antigen, and that is bad news. You can't escape it, you can't get rid of it, it's you. So, lupus is a general kind of term for antibodies against various tissues. You generate inflammation. You can have discoid lupus, in which you have an immune response against the skin. You can have other immune responses that are categorized as lupus that are going to be widespread. There is a portion of the nucleus in animals that's called the nucleolus, which you maybe have heard of in AMP and things. The nucleolus is the site of ribosomal RNA production. There are people with lupus that end up generating antibodies against ribosomal RNAs, which are present in every single cell. And as cells begin to lyse or degrade, you have an immune response to it. And so this is happening all the time, and it becomes a systemic inflammation thing. Rheumatoid arthritis is, again, autoimmune. You're making antibodies against some of the components found in joints, extracellular matrix proteins and things like this. Hashimoto's disease. This is an autoimmune disease in which you begin to attack the thyroid, not the thymus, the thyroid, which is responsible for producing thyroid hormone, which is generally thought of as the metabolic thermostat for cells. So, as Hashimoto's progresses over a period of probably, certainly months to years, the ability of the thyroid to produce thyroxine is decreased, and you start to have hypothyroidism, or a low thyroid number, and that's when people then can fairly easily go on synthetic thyroid medicine for that. So diabetes type 1 specifically. This is an immunological response that destroys the pancreatic beta cells. This is the cells that these are the cells that are producing insulin. You ablate them, you don't have any insulin production. All right, so there are a bunch of other autoimmune disease, multiple sclerosis, Addison's, Graves. A lot of times the treatment for this is steroid hormones, which can just, in general, reduce inflammation and reduce the immune response. So we have sort of a general summary here. The antigen is going to activate B cells, which in turn are generating antibodies. Antigen is going to interact with helper T cells, which they are producing cytokines and triggering the B cell response, and then also activating the cytotoxic T cells. The helper Ts are involved in developing the immune response. The B cells are producing antibodies. The antibodies are guiding some of these different kinds of white blood cells or phagocytes. The cytotoxic T cells are the direct killers, and they're the ones that are actually bearing down on cells and destroying them. So, after the immune response, what's supposed to happen is that the plasma cells, if they're not being triggered by an immune response, they begin to slow up. They begin to die. And the antibodies begin to be degraded in the blood. The T cells, helper and cytotoxic, they're going to be deactivated because there is no antigen, there are no cytokines, and they gradually slow up. A few of them, B and the different Ts, are going to differentiate into memory cells. That is, they're not going to degrade. And this results in a collection of cells that are now ready for the next time it happens. This is the critical point of an immunization. The immunization is developing this collection of cells that initially are present and then can hopefully turn into memory cells. And so when we do see a viral infection the next time, you're not starting from the ground up. You're not starting from a dead start or a dead stop, whatever. You have a head start on this thing. You have cells that are ready to go, and you can have a very rapid response. So when we have been exposed to the virus or to whatever kind of antigen, it takes a while, several weeks, to develop a sufficient immune response. But once you have that, you now can respond to it much more quickly, which is why if you've been vaccinated or if you've had the specific disease, the second time around, your body is able to fight it off so much more effectively because you don't have to wait for these cells to come up to speed and generate a sufficient collection. They are already there. So you don't have these, the requirement to have the cells that are producing the appropriate antibody begin to divide and start to class switch. So this is a little review here. And actually we're going to save this for Friday, just to say that we're going to meet up on Friday, because otherwise we wouldn't have anything to do. But we'll also do a little bit of discussion about some of the current events going on as well. So let's knock off here and pick up on Friday. And I'll see you then. Hope you guys out there in YouTube land are feeling better. Fluids, rest, take it easy.